It was the greatest challenge ever posed to the human mind, a puzzle that humbled geniuses for 350 years, and it was born not in a laboratory, but in a margin. His name was Pierre de Fermat, a civil servant, a father, a ghost. In a quiet study lit by a single candle, he turned the page of an ancient book, and in a moment of pure, untethered thought, he saw further than any man alive. He claimed to have a proof, a marvelous proof, but the margin was too small to contain it. He closed the book. He blew out the candle. He took his secret to the grave. And with it, he unleashed a phantom, a demon of curiosity that would haunt the brightest minds for centuries. It promised immortality. It delivered obsession. It broke the hearts of those who came closest. Until one man, Andrew Wiles, stood before the world and believed he had conquered the mountain. But the ghost had one last trick to play. The proof collapsed. The dream shattered. Was Fermat a trickster, a true genius who saw a path we could not, or simply a man who, in a moment of transcendent clarity, made a mistake, and in doing so, gave the world a reason to climb? This is the story of that margin, and the mountain it made. To understand the ghost, we must first meet the man. In the sun-drenched streets of 17th century Toulouse, Pierre de Fermat was not a revolutionary. He was the establishment. By day, he was a magistrate, a royal counselor. His world was one of gavels and parchments, of property disputes and tax law. He moved through a life of quiet respectability, a husband, a father, a figure of sober protocol. His hands were stained with the ink of legal decrees, not philosophical manuscripts. His mind, in the light of day, was trained on the tangible conflicts of men. This was the documented life, the first life, a life that left a clear, conventional paper trail in the archives of the Toulouse Parliament. But genius often casts its longest shadow in the direction the world is not looking. And as the sun set and the last legal document was sealed, the respectable magistrate would climb a private staircase, light a single candle, and become someone else entirely. With the door closed and the world shut out, the second life began. The candle was not just a light, it was a signal fire, calling across the centuries. Here, in the silent dialogue of his own mind, the magistrate became a conjurer. His partner in conversation was a ghost from Alexandria, Diophantus. He did not merely read the ancient problems, he challenged them, he corrected them. The margins of his book became a battleground where the 17th century dueled with the ancient world and won. His quill moved with a quiet fury. He was not writing for publication or for praise. This was a pure, private, and rapturous communion with the Absolute. He was building cathedrals of pure thought where no one would ever worship, discovering continents of logic no living soul would ever see. In these secret hours, he forged the very tools of modern number theory. He penned his little theorem, a law of primes so foundational it would power the cryptography of the digital age, and treated it as a casual aside, a trivial observation. He saw patterns in the chaos of numbers that were nothing short of clairvoyance. And then, with breathtaking arrogance, he would simply move on. He left the treasures buried, marking the spot with only a cryptic note, as if the journey to unearth them was beneath him. The candle flame would gutter. The shadows on the wall would twist into giant, thinking shapes. And in that pool of golden light, a ghost was being born, not in the text, but in the spaces between the lines, in the margins where his brilliance and his secrets took root. He would close the book, blow out the flame, and return to bed, leaving his most profound self locked in the dark with the whispering pages. A life of sublime, solitary discovery, destined to haunt the future from the grave of a closed book. But genius, even in hiding, yearns for a mirror. It needs a rival, a counterpart. For Fermat, the silence of his study became a kind of cathedral, but even a monk must sometimes pray with others. His one confessor was a friar in Paris, Father Marin Mersenne, a man who was not a genius himself, but a genius collector, a living, breathing hub for the scientific revolution. His cell was a switchboard for the mind of Europe. And so the secret judge of Toulouse began to send letters, not signed proclamations, but elegant, sly bombshells wrapped in the polite formality of a civil servant. They traveled the rutted roads of France, a nervous system of parchment and ink, connecting his solitary brain to the world. Through Mersenne, Fermat found his peers, and he announced himself not with a fanfare, but with a series of perfectly aimed provocations. To the great philosopher René Descartes in Holland, the towering, egotistical architect of reason, Fermat sent a cool correction to his work on optics, a mathematical slap. Descartes, the lion of French thought, roared in fury at this upstart bureaucrat. He called Fermat a braggart. He tried to have him silenced, but the truth in Fermat's math was a wall he could not breach. Then, to the young prodigy Blaise Pascal, a soul tormented by God and geometry, Fermat sent not a challenge, but an invitation, a problem about dice and bets. From this exchange of letters between the serene judge and the anguished philosopher, an entirely new science was born, the mathematics of chance, probability. They forged the future over a gambling table they never saw. Through the postal network, Fermat became a phantom poltergeist of European science. His physical body remained in Toulouse, signing land deeds, but his intellect was everywhere at once, irritating Descartes, collaborating with Pascal, dismantling and rebuilding the work of the age from 1,000 miles away. He was the ultimate insider and outsider, the establishment man who, under cover of elegant correspondence, was quietly rewriting the establishment of human knowledge itself. The ghost was learning to speak, and his first words were a paradox, a whisper that could silence a giant.
Yet of all the minds his letters touched, one connection would burn with a different light. Not rivalry, but revelation. This was not a duel, it was a duet. His partner was Blaise Pascal, a young man whose genius was a torment to him, a mind scorched by divine fire and haunted by infinity. Where Fermat was cool, logical, serene, Pascal was all fever and fervor, seeking God in geometry and terror in the void. Their dialogue began, improbably, over a question of dice, a nobleman's idle puzzle about interrupted gambling games, a problem of fairness in a world of chance. To Pascal, it was a moral labyrinth. To Fermat, it was simply a structure to be dissected. And in their letters, we witnessed the breathtaking moment of creation. Pascal, in Paris, pours his anguish onto the page. His methods are brilliant, intuitive, wrapped in mystical certainty. Fermat, in his sunlit study in Toulouse, receives them. His reply is a model of dispassionate clarity. He lays out the solution not with poetry, but with an iron logic that even Pascal's storm-tossed soul could not deny. From this exchange between the tortured mystic and the serene judge, a new continent of thought was mapped. They gave humanity the tools to weigh the unknown, to measure likelihood, to see the hidden skeleton of order within chaos. They called it the theory of chances. We call it probability. It was Fermat's finest hour as a collaborator. Here he did not hide his proof. He built it, step by logical step, for another to see. It was his one truly shared masterpiece. And in that collaboration, we see the profound difference in their souls. For Pascal, mathematics was a path to the divine, a desperate prayer. For Fermat, it was the divine, a pure, playful, and perfectly sufficient universe of its own. When their work was done, Pascal would turn his back on mathematics, seeking his answer in a hair shirt and religious devotion. Fermat simply turned the page. He returned to his first and truest love, the silent, infinite conversation with prime numbers. He had shown he could build a bridge to another mind, but he preferred, in the end, the solitude of his own island. The connection with Pascal was a glimpse of the ghost stepping into the light before retreating forever into the shadows of the margin.
Having built a bridge to the future with Pascal, Fermat did something telling. He turned his back on it. His collaboration on probability was a magnificent detour, but it was not his home. His true country, his secret kingdom, was one of absolute, crystalline purity, a realm untouched by the mess of dice, the greed of gamblers, or the noise of the world. He returned with a lover's focus to his first and deepest obsession, the prime numbers. Primes, those indivisible atoms of arithmetic, those numbers divisible only by one and themselves. To most, a dry curiosity. To Fermat, they were the stars in a perfect, infinite sky. He sought their hidden constellations, their secret laws. Here, in total secrecy, he became a true prophet. He scribbled conjectures that were less like guesses and more like oracles. He stated, almost in passing, that every prime number of a certain form could be written as the sum of two perfect squares, a breathtaking claim. He declared a rule, his little theorem, that described a mysterious, repeating dance that all prime numbers performed. These were not just discoveries, they were glimpses into the divine machinery. And yet, the most haunting pattern of all was not in the numbers, it was in his silence. For these monumental insights, he almost never offered a proof. He would declare a truth to the world, or to his own margin, and then stop, as if the journey to the summit was a private ecstasy, and planting the flag was all that mattered. Was it arrogance, a lack of time, or something more profound? Perhaps his mind worked not in the laborious, step-by-step logic of other mortals, but in great intuitive leaps. He saw the truth in a flash of connection, and the tedious work of building the staircase back down to where everyone else stood bored him. For him, the ecstasy was in the vision, not the blueprint. So he left his theorems as magnificent ruins, cathedrals without foundations, for other men to spend centuries painstakingly reconstructing the path he may have glimpsed in an instant. This was the essence of the ghost, a mind of lightning, not lantern light, a lover who whispered his most profound declarations into the dark, caring if anyone heard, only that he had spoken them to the universe. And in this habit of seeing farther than he could or would explain lay the seed of a catastrophe, a beautiful, intoxicating seed. For it was from this same profound, secretive confidence that his next and final marginal note would grow, a note that would eclipse all his other miracles and become an immortal curse. His love for primes was pure, but it was a love that prepared him to write one night a sentence that would turn mathematics into a prison and a paradise for generations to come. The stage was now set for immortality. It began, like all his revelations, in the silent hours, the house asleep, the city still, only the candle's vigil and the whisper of his own breath. He was working through his beloved Diophantus, through a problem about squares, about breaking a perfect square into two other perfect squares. The Pythagorean theorem, a truth ancient and settled. But Fermat's mind never rested at settled. It was an engine of generalization, of infinite questioning. What about cubes? The quill paused. His gaze turned inward, navigating a landscape of numbers only he could see. He pursued the idea through powers of 4, of 5, an endless ascent. And he found nothing, no solutions, a vast, silent desert, an impossibility. A profound conviction hardened in him, not a guess, a certainty. He saw, or believed he saw, the deep structural reason why. The truth was not just that he couldn't find examples, it was that no examples could exist to the endless end of the number line. Here was the moment, the fulcrum on which 3 centuries would balance. He dipped his quill. He did not reach for a fresh parchment to draft a grand treatise. He turned to the margin of the book itself, the intimate, private companion of his thoughts, and he wrote. First, the assertion of impossibility. It is impossible to separate a cube into 2 cubes, or a 4th power into 2 4th powers. The words flowed, definitive, calm, a judge delivering a verdict to the universe. Then the line that would echo through time, the spark that would become an inferno. I have discovered a truly marvelous proof of this, which this margin is too narrow to contain. The quill laid down. He did not ring a bell. He did not call for a scribe. He simply closed the book. The marvelous proof existed now only in the ether of his own conviction. He had conversed with the Absolute, received its secret, and chosen, consciously or not, to bury the map. Was it a private joke, a divine arrogance, or the tragic oversight of a mind that moved too fast for its own good? He blew out the candle. The room plunged into a darkness now pregnant with a phantom. He had just penned a ghost that would outlive his body, his name, his century. A ghost of a proof for a theorem that would become the most famous riddle in human history. He left it there, a sleeping dragon in the margin of a book. And in that act, the judge passed a sentence of obsession on countless minds yet unborn. The mountain had just been formed, with a single, effortless stroke of ink. He had created a siren's song, an equation of childlike simplicity with a hidden, infinite sharpness. It looked like a playful twist on a grade school puzzle. The Pythagorean theorem we all know, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It has endless solutions, 3, 4, 5, 5, 12, 13, a harmony. Fermat's twist was a single devastating exponent. He asked, what if the power is not a square, but a cube, or a 4th power, or any higher power whatsoever? X to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n, for n greater than 2. The statement is so simple you feel you could almost touch it. You could explain it to a curious child. And that is its sublime trap. For within that simplicity lies a fathomless ocean of impossibility. It is a declaration that across the endless expanse of all numbers, no trio of numbers will ever satisfy this equation. Ever. The problem became a sphinx. It whispered, "It cannot be done." And to every mathematician who heard it, it issued a primal challenge. Prove it. But how do you prove something never happens? Not just for the first million numbers, but for all numbers. To prove a negative against infinity. You could check 1,000 cases, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000. It meant nothing. Infinity laughed at brute force. The solution required not computation, but revelation, a proof that had to cage the concept of number itself. It was a locked room at the center of mathematics. The equation was the lock, exquisitely simple, and Fermat claimed to have held the key, a marvelous proof, which he then vanished into thin air. So the monster wore a mask of innocence. It seduced with its clarity. It promised a fame that echoed through centuries, and then, when grasped, it revealed its true nature, a sheer cliff face with no handholds, stretching forever into the clouds. It was no longer a problem. It was a place, a territory of pure, austere struggle, and he had just drawn the first and only map to its base, a map that pointed to a treasure and then burned itself to ashes in their hands. The margin note was not a challenge, it was a creation myth, and the creature it birthed was now alive, waiting in the dark of the closed book, on the shelf of a man who had only a few years left to live.
5 years later, the secret judge was called to his final verdict. Pierre de Fermat died as he had lived, quietly, locally, with the ordinary dignity of a public official. There was no national mourning, no scholarly elegies for a lost giant of science. The world of mathematics hardly noticed. To them, he had always been a spectral presence. His absence changed little. His study was sealed, his legal papers were filed away, and on a shelf among his personal effects remained his copy of Diophantus's Arithmetica, the faithful companion of his nights, now a silent tomb for a ghost. The key to the tomb was his eldest son, Clément Samuel, a man who revered his father not as a magistrate, but as a scholar. Grieving and driven by filial duty, he undertook the task of preserving the true legacy. He began to collect the scattered letters, the notes, the precious cryptic marginalia. And then he opened the Arithmetica. We can only imagine his finger tracing the lines of his father's handwriting, the casual brilliance, the towering claims, and then landing on that page, on that margin. He read the claim of impossibility, and he read the irresistible, devastating footnote, "I have discovered a truly marvelous proof." In that moment, Clément Samuel faced a choice: to keep his father's secret, a private monument to a private genius, or to publish it, to unleash it. He chose to publish. In 1670, in a posthumous edition of Diophantus called Observations on Diophantus, the margin note was set in type and released to the world. The ghost was given a voice, a challenge, and immortality. The private victory was over. The public war had begun. With the scratch of a printing press, a solitary man's midnight conviction was transformed into a public oracle, a sphinx's riddle for all of Europe and then all the world. The judge had passed from the earth, but the sentence he had written in that margin was now perpetual. It would live on, tirelessly prosecuting the intellect of every generation to come. He had bequeathed to humanity not a proof, but a ghost, and the ghost was hungry. The gauntlet was thrown, and the first to take it up were the giants. Leonhard Euler, the most prolific mathematician in history, a mind of boundless energy and creativity, turned his gaze to the theorem. He saw a foothold where others saw only a cliff. For the case of n=3, cubes, he forged a proof. It was a monumental victory, the first crack in the stone face of the mountain. But in that victory lay a terrifying revelation. His method was brilliant, specific, and agonizingly complex. It did not illuminate a path upward, it merely proved that this single ledge existed.
To scale the next case, n equals 5, would require inventing an entirely new set of tools. The mountain was not a single peak, but an endless range, each step higher demanding a new kind of strength. Euler had not found the root, he had discovered the true scale of the despair. Then came a climber of a different kind, one the mountain should never have allowed to attempt the ascent. Her name was Sophie Germain. In an age that barred women from universities, from academies, from the very conversation of science, she became a ghost herself. She taught herself mathematics by night, using the lecture notes of male students as her scripture. And when she dared to write to the great men of the age, she did so under a male pseudonym, Monsieur Leblanc. Her mind was formidable. She saw a structure others missed. While men attacked the problem head-on, she devised a grand strategic approach, a way to prove that for whole classes of prime numbers, the equation could have no solution. Her general approach was a masterstroke, the first real theory to attack the infinite problem, not case by case, but in sweeping waves. When her true identity was discovered, the shock was not scandal, but awe. The great Carl Friedrich Gauss, the prince of mathematicians, wrote to her with profound respect. When a person of the sex which, according to our customs and prejudices, must encounter infinitely more difficulties than men, succeeds in overcoming these fetters, she doubtless has the most noble courage, extraordinary talent, and superior genius. Sophie Germain did not conquer the mountain, but she built the first vital base camp upon its slopes. Her story was no longer just about numbers, it was about the sheer force of human will against impossibility, both mathematical and societal. She embodied the theorem's new power. It was not merely a test of intellect, but of spirit. The mountain had claimed its first souls, Euler's with the despair of glimpsing the infinite climb, and Germain's with the tragic, glorious triumph of climbing at all. The ghost of Fermat was no longer haunting just mathematics, it was haunting history. The 18th century had tried. The 19th century began to realize the terrible truth. The theorem was not just difficult, it was corrosive. It became known in whispers as the mathematical disease. Amateurs and geniuses alike were infected. They would approach it with bright confidence, armed with classical tools, only to watch their logic crumble against its infinite walls. Promising careers veered into this cul-de-sac and stalled forever. Countless manuscripts flooded academies, packed with fervent, flawless proofs that always contained a single, fatal flaw. The world offered prizes, feeding the obsession. The French Academy dangled medals, but the greatest lure was a bounty born of despair. A German industrialist, Paul Wolfscale, allegedly on the brink of suicide, turned to Fermat's problem one last night. Captivated, he lost track of time, and the moment of his intended death passed. In gratitude to the theorem for saving his life, he left a vast fortune to whoever could solve it. The Wolfscale Prize turned the disease into a gold rush. The proofs and the crackpots multiplied. But for every sincere seeker, the mountain exacted a price. It demanded not just intelligence, but sanity. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer would call it a trap designed to waste the time and brains of men. It became a byword for impossible quests. Yet within this century of failure, a profound reversal was taking place. The mountain could not be climbed with the existing tools, so the climbers were forced to invent new ones. Faced with the impregnable fortress of Fermat's last theorem, mathematicians did not just bang on the gate, they retreated. They surveyed the entire landscape, and they began, painstakingly, to construct new kingdoms of thought around it. They forged algebraic number theory, dreaming up new types of numbers to attack the problem. They built ring theory and ideal theory, frameworks of exquisite abstraction. They were not just solving an equation, they were learning a new language to even describe the battle. The failure was total, but it was a fertile, glorious failure. Each collapsed proof revealed a new weakness in mathematics itself, a weakness that could only be remedied by creating more powerful structures. The descent into madness was not a retreat, it was a strategic dispersal. The army had broken camp and was now constructing a whole new civilization from which to launch the final siege. The problem was no longer a puzzle, it was an engine, a cruel, brilliant engine for the evolution of human thought itself. The mountain would not yield, and so the climbers were forced to become architects. They stopped trying to scale the sheer cliff face of Fermat's equation directly. Instead, they stepped back. They surveyed the entire mathematical landscape and began to construct a new one. The impossible problem became a furnace, and in its heat they forged the tools of the future. It began with a retreat into deeper abstraction. To even ask the question properly, they had to invent new languages. First, they built algebraic number theory. They dreamed up entirely new species of numbers, ideal numbers, to dissect the prime factors lurking in the equation. It was like inventing a new microscope to see a previously invisible world. Then came elliptic curves. These were not curves from geometry class, but sleek, profound objects described by deceptively simple cubic equations. They were mathematical enigmas in their own right, each one a universe of questions. And finally, the most esoteric and powerful of all, modular forms. These were shapes not in physical space, but in the realm of complex numbers, infinite, symmetrical, holographic objects that seemed to hum with a secret harmony of the universe. They were the most non-obvious pieces of mathematics imaginable. For decades, these fields grew in isolation. Number theorists spoke one language, the geometers of elliptic curves spoke another. The masters of modular forms spoke a third, almost mystical dialect. They were all working in distant wings of the same cathedral, unaware they were building toward the same spire. Yet a profound suspicion began to emerge, a haunting sense of a hidden bridge. Mathematicians began to notice uncanny echoes, strange correspondences between the world of elliptic curves and the world of modular forms. It was as if two completely different musical scores were, note for note, the same symphony. The Taniyama-Shimura conjecture was born from this suspicion. It proposed boldly that every elliptic curve was modular, that these two unimaginably different mathematical universes were in fact mirror images, a unifying principle of breathtaking depth. And then the connection was made. In the 1980s, Gerhard Frey had a revolutionary thought. He suggested that if anyone ever found a counterexample to Fermat's last theorem, a single magical set of numbers that solved the equation, that set of numbers could be used to construct an elliptic curve so weird, so broken, that it could not be modular. Frey's idea was the spark that lit the final fuse. It transformed Fermat's ancient riddle. It meant that proving the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture, proving that every elliptic curve is modular, would automatically prove Fermat's last theorem, because a counterexample would create a non-modular curve, and that would be impossible. The ghost's riddle was no longer a lonely mountain. It was now the keystone in a vast, beautiful arch connecting the great continents of mathematics. To solve the childish puzzle of cubes and squares, you first had to unite the deepest ideas of the modern age. Fermat's Pargin had become a manifesto for the unity of all mathematics. The climbers were gone. Now the architects held the plans. And one of them, a quiet man who had dreamed of this problem since he was 10 years old, looked at those blueprints and knew what he had to do. He would attempt to build the bridge itself. In a quiet house in Princeton, New Jersey, a man closed the door of his attic study. He was not a 17th century magistrate. He was a 20th century professor, Andrew Wiles. But he was about to enter the same pact of secrecy that had defined the ghost himself. His obsession began not with a margin, but with a library book. He was 10 years old in Cambridge, England, when he first encountered the story of Fermat's last theorem. The problem captured him with the purity of a fairy tale, a riddle anyone could understand that no one on earth could solve. To a child's mind, it was a call, a personal summons from history. He would solve it. But as he matured into one of the world's finest number theorists, he learned the brutal truth. The tools of his childhood were useless. The simple problem was now buried under mountains of abstraction. To even approach it was considered professional suicide, a quick way to squander a career in a bottomless pit. So he bided his time. He mastered the new languages, elliptic curves, modular forms. And when the link was forged, the revelation that proving the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture would prove Fermat, he saw his path. A narrow, treacherous, but existent path to the summit. He made a decision of immense courage and loneliness. He would go dark. For 7 years, Andrew Wiles retreated. To the outside world, he published smaller papers, taught his classes. But his true work, the Great War, was conducted in absolute secrecy. He worked alone. He confided in no one. He became a monk of mathematics, just as Fermat had been. His battlefield was his Princeton attic, the chalkboard, the endless reams of paper, the silent, grinding hours that stretched into years. The ghost of Fermat was his only companion, and the ghosts of all the failed climbers his constant witnesses. He was not just proving a theorem, he was attempting to complete the bridge between two continents of mathematics. Every calculation was a step on a swaying rope over an abyss. The pressure was not merely intellectual, it was historical, emotional, a weight of 350 years of failure bearing down on one man's shoulders. He lived in constant fear, not just of a mistake, but of being preempted, that another mind somewhere in the world would cross the finish line first, that after his 7-year pilgrimage he would find the flag of victory already planted. In his secrecy, he became the direct echo of Pierre de Fermat, one man in a room, armed only with his mind, chasing a truth that had tormented centuries. The ghost had finally found a worthy successor, a modern warrior preparing to storm the ancient mountain, armed with weapons the ghost could never have dreamed of. The only question that remained was whether this story would end like Fermat's, with a secret triumph and a maddening silence, or with a cry of victory that would echo around the world. The attic held its breath. The final ascent had begun. For 7 years he had worked in silence. Now he would speak. The setting was a lecture series in Cambridge, England, in June of 1993. The air was thick, not with summer heat, but with a buzzing, electric rumor. Andrew Wiles was giving 3 lectures. He had announced a vague title about elliptic curves and modular forms, but the cognoscenti knew. The mathematical world held its breath. He did not announce his target, not at first. He built his bridge, girder by logical girder, over 3 days. The audience leaned in, a silent congregation witnessing a private mass for the initiated. And then, on the 3rd day, he approached the final majestic arch. He wrote the statement of the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture on the board. He connected it, through the work of others, to Fermat's equation. He turned to the room. The silence was absolute. With a calm that belied the earthquake within, he spoke the words he had dreamed of for 30 years. And this, therefore, proves Fermat's last theorem. I think I'll stop here. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the dam broke. The room erupted, a roaring, cathartic wave of applause and disbelief. Mathematicians wept. Film cameras, present almost by chance, captured history. The news flashed around the globe. Fermat's last theorem solved. The 350-year war was over. Andrew Wiles was a superstar. The shy professor was thrust onto front pages, into television lights, hailed as a conqueror of the impossible. The ghost, it seemed, had been exorcised. But the mountain had one last avalanche in reserve. The proof manuscript, now under the merciless scrutiny of the world's finest experts, contained a tiny, almost innocent flaw, a gap in the method, a single stubborn stone that refused to fit into the grand arch. A referee found it. The word began to spread in panicked whispers. The magnificent bridge had a fault line. Wiles was plunged from the summit into the deepest crevasse. He worked desperately, privately, to patch the gap. Months passed. The pressure was now a global, crushing weight. Every day the dream curdled further into a nightmare of public failure. He confessed it publicly in a devastating announcement. The proof, as it stood, was incomplete. The flaw might be fatal. The narrative turned cruel. The conquering hero was now becoming the latest, greatest victim of the mathematical disease. He was Icarus, who had flown too close to the sun of legend, and now was falling before the eyes of the world. The celebration was over. The champagne was sour. The mountain, bloodied and scarred by his assault, still stood. And Andrew Wiles was alone again in his attic, staring at the wreckage of 7 years of his life, with the mocking whisper of the margin note echoing louder than ever. The abyss had opened, and he was falling. The fall was public. The climb back would be utterly, excruciatingly private. Andrew Wiles returned to his attic. The global spotlight became a searing, judgmental sun. He was a man stranded on a ledge, the world waiting to see if he would plummet into the chasm of failure where so many others lay. For a year, he fought. This was no longer the grand architectural campaign of the 7-year siege. This was trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat with a single, malignant flaw. He tried every tool, every approach. He brought in a trusted lieutenant, his former student, Richard Taylor. Together, they attacked the problem from every angle, and every angle failed. The original method, the beautiful structure he had built, was intractable. The flaw would not be patched. It demanded a revelation. Despair set in, a deep professional dread that he had been wrong, that the mountain was invincible, that he was destined to be its most famous casualty. He was on the verge of admitting defeat, of publishing his flawed proof as a monument to how close one could come. And then, in a moment of exhausted, last-ditch clarity, he did what all great mathematicians must do when trapped. He examined the flaw itself, not as an enemy, but as a messenger. He looked at the very obstruction that was blocking his path, and in a flash of insight that can only be described as spiritual, he saw it not as a wall, but as a signpost. The failing method, the one he had clung to for 7 years, would never work, but its failure illuminated the faint outline of an older, forgotten method he had abandoned years before. It was a moment of terrifying humility. To succeed, he had to dismantle the work of a year and return to the work of 7. He had to merge the old, abandoned approach with the new, failing one. It was a Hail Mary pass in the most profound sense. On the morning of September 19, 1994, he was examining this merger, testing its possibilities. He wasn't expecting triumph. He was checking a ledger of defeat. And then he saw it. The connection snapped into place. The old and the new intertwined perfectly. The flaw was not just circumvented, it was made irrelevant. The very thing that broke the proof became the key to completing it. The moment was quiet. There was no choir, no crash of cymbals, just a man in a room, understanding something that no one on earth had understood until that second. He checked, and checked again. The structure held. It was complete. It was beautiful. The long defeat was over. The bridge stood. The final stone had been set, not with a shout, but with a sigh of absolute, exhausted certainty. The ghost's riddle had been solved. This time, for real. He had stared into the abyss for a year, and in the end, he had not just climbed out, he had learned to fly. The world celebrated. When the corrected, peer-reviewed proof was published in 1995, the victory was complete and undeniable. Andrew Wiles had done the impossible. He had scaled the mountain. The 350-year odyssey was over. Headlines proclaimed the end of an epic. Prizes were awarded, knighthood conferred. The name Wiles was now irrevocably chiseled beside Fermat's in the history of human thought. But in the quiet that followed the fanfare, a single haunting question remained, echoing from the 17th century. It was the question that had launched the whole saga, the ghost's original claim. Did Fermat actually have a proof? The answer, delivered not with malice, but with the sober voice of modern mathematics, was a gentle, definitive no. The tools Wiles used, the modularity theorem, the frameworks of algebraic geometry, the entire edifice of 20th century number theory, were centuries beyond Fermat's imagination. They were concepts as alien to Fermat's world as a silicon chip would be to a quill pen. His margin was not merely too narrow, his century was too narrow. Fermat had a pattern. He saw a truth, intuited a path, and declared victory. For his other theorems, his intuition was legendary and correct, even if his proofs were often sketches. But for this, the ultimate theorem, the consensus is clear. His intuition had met its match. He almost certainly had a proof for a specific case, or a brilliant insight that he believed generalized to all cases. In the candlelight, it must have felt complete, marvelous, but in the harsh dawn of modern scrutiny, it would have contained a hidden flaw, an assumption about the behavior of numbers that only the mathematics of the future would reveal to be false. This is not an indictment, it is a liberation. It means Fermat was not a trickster, but a human, a genius who flew too close to the sun on the wings of his own brilliance. His error was not one of petty deceit, but of sublime overreach. And in that error lay his greatest unintended gift. For if his proof had been valid, the story would have ended in 1637, a footnote. Instead, his mistake, his magnificent, confident mistake, became a beacon. It lit a fire that compelled humanity to build a taller, stronger, more beautiful intellectual ladder than he could ever have conceived. Wiles did not find Fermat's proof. He built Fermat's cathedral. The ghost did not hand us the key. He left us a locked door, so compelling that we invented entirely new worlds to find the lockmaker. The summit was reached, but the truth waiting there was not the one the climbers expected. It was better. It was the truth about the climb itself. So here at the summit, we are left with the ghost, the man, and the truth. The truth is this: Andrew Wiles's proof is one of the most profound and intricate mathematical structures ever built, but it is not, and could not be, the proof Fermat possessed. The experts are unanimous. The path Wiles took, through the modularity of elliptic curves, traverses mathematical landscapes undiscovered for 300 years after Fermat's death. Fermat's tools were those of the ancient Greeks, refined by a brilliant amateur intuition. They were powerful, but they were not magical. They could not see into the deep connective tissue of the mathematical universe that Wiles was forced to navigate. The most likely explanation is both simple and profound. In a moment of towering confidence, Fermat saw a pattern. He devised an argument, perhaps using a method he called infinite descent, that he believed generalized to all powers. He wrote his triumphant note to himself. And somewhere in the chain of that logic, hidden even from his own piercing gaze, was a subtle, fatal assumption, a beautiful mistake. The ghost was not lying, he was simply wrong. But this unmasking is not a humiliation. It is the final, liberating twist of the entire saga. For it means that Fermat's last theorem was never really about one equation. It was a spark that fell into the tinder of human curiosity. And the fire it started did not just burn for 350 years. It illuminated whole new realms of mathematics that became the true prize. Fermat, in his error, gave us a compass that pointed beyond his own horizon. He forced us to invent new languages, forge new alliances between ideas, and discover that mathematics is not a collection of isolated facts, but a single, breathtakingly connected universe. The ghost's marvelous proof was a mirage, but the pursuit of that mirage built a paradise of new knowledge. In the end, the man who was wrong achieved something far greater than being right. He became an eternal question. And, in mathematics, as in life, a great question is infinitely more valuable than a simple answer. The mountain is climbed, the proof is secure, and the ghost, having led us to a vista he could never have imagined, can finally rest. His greatest theorem was not a statement about numbers. It was a statement about us. 3.5 centuries, a mountain of effort, built from a footnote. So what did we find at the end of it all? Not a secret, not a trick. We found ourselves. Fermat's true bequest was not a theorem, it was a testament to the relentless, beautiful, and sometimes maddening human need to know. He gave us not an answer, but an echo that grew louder with every passing decade, compelling the finest minds of each generation to listen and to strive. The page from the Arithmetica is in a library now, a relic. The ink is faded, but the idea it unleashed is more alive than ever. For the tools forged in the fight, the modular forms, the elliptic curves, the new languages of number theory, they did not retire with the victory. They became the bedrock of our digital age. They secure our communications on the internet. They map the frontiers of theoretical physics. The climb built the very tools that now build our world. Andrew Wiles fulfilled a boyhood dream, and in doing so, completed a circle that began in candlelight. He proved that the mountain could be climbed, but with tools the first climber never possessed. And Fermat, the ghost, is resolved. He was not a trickster, he was the spark. A man who, in a moment of private, glorious certainty, dared to write down a challenge to eternity. And eternity, in its turn, accepted. So look again at that simple equation. X to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n. It is no longer a threat. It is a lighthouse, a monument not to a solution, but to the journey. Proof that from the smallest margin, the narrowest space, can flow an infinite river of curiosity. He did not give us the answer, he gave us a reason to climb. And in the long, magnificent, arduous climb, we discovered everything. That, perhaps, was the most marvelous proof of all.